Greetings. This is the John Savers Variety Spotlight Show. My name is John Savers. I'm your host. Today we'll have an interesting program for you, one calculated to be enjoyable, educational, improving, wholesome, piquing your interest in all ways. So on that note, let's go forth to this first half hour. Let's take it away now.
Hello, my name is Harry Zane. I'm a candidate for president, an independent candidate. This is the 7th session that I've recorded. I spoke in previous sessions about the fact that the world, the political structure of the world, has got the world divided into two world camps. One is headed by Queen Elizabeth in London. The other is headed by David Rockefeller in New York. My third and fourth presentations went into great detail about that political structure. I've got to repeat just a little bit, less than 5 minutes worth of that content in order to set the stage for the current session. It's absolutely necessary that I repeat a few minutes worth. I explained in my earlier tapes, numbers 3 and 4, that the United States presidents, our presidents over the larger part of the last century, have been knowingly and deliberately subordinate to that structure that I just described a minute ago. In other words, every president, the current president and every recent president, has knowingly taken third, fourth, or fifth place instead of first place in our government, our effectual government. The Constitution places him in first place, but every person who has held the office of president here in America for the better part of the last century has deliberately and knowingly and deliberately, unbeknownst to most of the public, allowed himself to be only number 3 or number 4 or number 5 on the list of, in the ranking of high authority over our country, in favor of allowing either David Rockefeller or Queen Elizabeth to be in the number 1 spot, depending upon which of those two camps that specific president was in. I mentioned, for example, that President Ford was in Queen Elizabeth's camp. And so while he was president, he considered Queen Elizabeth to be the true head of state of our country, and he and Kissinger, who is David Rockefeller's right-hand man, to be the second-ranking or viceroy or vice head of state over our country, and himself, President Ford, to be only third or fourth or fifth in rank. After those two, and perhaps after one or two more subordinates of those two. After President Ford came President Carter. President Carter was in the New York camp. That's Mr. Rockefeller's camp. It can also be described as the Jewish camp or the Jewish party. It's the party to which 99.9% of all Jews adhere. Now, President Carter considered Mr. Rockefeller and Mr. Kissinger to be the ranking authorities in our country, and he himself, President Carter, to be only number 3 or 4 or 5. A minute ago I said President Ford. I don't know if I said Rockefeller or Queen Elizabeth. President Ford considered Queen Elizabeth to be the head of state. So he would have considered her the top-ranking official in our country, and her top assistants, like Lady Susan Hussey, to be the second ranking, and Governor Arch Moore of West Virginia, who is their regent in this country, to be the third ranking, and he himself, Gerald Ford, to be only the fourth ranking, if even that high, maybe even lower than that. So President Ford was under Queen Elizabeth. President Carter was under David Rockefeller. The next one, Reagan, was under Queen Elizabeth. The next one, George Bush the elder, was under David Rockefeller and Kissinger. The next one, Clinton, was under Queen Elizabeth and her top officials. The next one, Bush the younger, was under Rockefeller and Kissinger. And the current one, our current president, is also under Rockefeller and Kissinger. Now, I gave several illustrations in my previous tape, and again, my repetition will only be brief, and then I'll continue with new material that I've not spoken of before. But to continue with my recapitulation, I gave several illustrations in my earlier tapes, in tape number 3, for example, of this fact. I mentioned that the U.S. presidents have shown a worshipful kind of deference that they really don't have any right to show. In fact, our Constitution forbids it expressly. And even if it didn't forbid it expressly, it would forbid it implicitly. But they have shown a kind of worshipful deference and respect to these monarchs, not only the monarch to whose camp that specific president belongs, but even to the opposite camp's monarch. So, for example, George Bush the younger, even though he belonged to Rockefeller's camp, the Jewish camp, he showed a very worshipful kind of deference to Queen Elizabeth. I gave the example of him giving her a white tie party in 2007. He cracked a few jokes at her expense, and he did that because he's not in her camp, he's in the other camp. But the bottom line was that he treated her like a monarch, even though she's a monarch of the opposing camp. And when I say treated her like a monarch, I mean he gave her special signs of worshipful respect that he doesn't give to other monarchs like the King of Jordan or the Queen of Sweden or the Queen of the Netherlands when they come and visit. But when Queen Elizabeth came and visited in 2007, he treated her with a kind of worship that he only treated her with and no one else, except Rockefeller, who is the monarch of his own camp. I mentioned also that he referred to Rockefeller as God when he addressed the people at Yankee Stadium shortly after the events of September 11, 2001. And I mentioned also the example of Ronald Reagan, who was in Queen Elizabeth's camp, paying the same kind of worshipful respect to the monarch of the other camp, Rockefeller, that Bush, the younger, who was in Rockefeller's camp, paid to Elizabeth, even though she was of the opposing party. The example that I gave was that of Reagan saying to a very tall basketball player who had to duck his head when he came into the Oval Office, "You don't have to bow to me. I'm not king. I'm only president." And I explained in that tape, that was tape number 3, that although most of the nationwide viewers of that little staged scene thought of it as merely a harmless joke, it was not a joke at all. It was Mr. Reagan conveying to Mr. Rockefeller and to everyone else who understood what he was doing that he was going to be a very dutiful commoner, even to the monarch of the opposing side. not to mention to the monarch of his own side. That would be Queen Elizabeth. But even to the monarch of the opposite side, Rockefeller, Mr. Reagan was going to be very subservient. Now I'll continue with material that I have not spoken of before or not described before. There are some more examples of this that I'll give. At President Nixon's funeral in 1994, there were several former presidents there, along with the current president, President Clinton. But in the procession, instead of one of the presidents leading that procession, either our current president at that time, Mr. Clinton, or one of the former presidents, you might think that it might have been perhaps the eldest of them. Instead, it was none of them, it was Kissinger. David Rockefeller was not in attendance. If he had been, it would have been Rockefeller. But it was Kissinger, who was Rockefeller's CEO, so to speak. Kissinger led the procession. Right behind him was President George Bush the elder. And further back were Presidents Clinton and Ford and Carter, and I think Reagan was there. There were several presidents there, but the one who led the procession was Henry Kissinger. Now, why would Henry Kissinger be leading a procession of current and former United States presidents? There's no other possible explanation for that, except that it agrees perfectly with what I've just been explaining over the last 5 minutes or so. Here's another example. At the funeral of either President Ford or President Reagan, I think it was President Ford, Kissinger was at the pulpit at the National Cathedral in Washington. And, of course, he shouldn't have even been in the church. The Christian church for 2,000 years did not allow any non-Christians to come into the church, let alone stand at the pulpit. But he was standing at the pulpit. So seriously do the Christian churches nowadays take their profession that they'll put anybody in the pulpit. Even if it's the worst enemy of Christianity, they'll put them in the pulpit because they don't really know what they're doing and they don't really care what they're doing. It's all for show. None of it's real with these churches. But Henry Kissinger was in the pulpit, and he used several times the plural pronoun we, but he wasn't referring to any plural of persons, plurality of persons. He was referring to himself. He was referring to himself. He was using the so-called royal we, the royal plural. He was referring to himself the way the European monarchs used to refer to themselves in past centuries, with the plural, we and us, instead of I or me. And he did that ostentatiously several times during his speech. And it was totally unnatural. I mean, it was out of consonance with the grammar and the syntax of his speech. But he did that on purpose in order to flaunt the fact that our presidents are under a royal regime, of which he is a major principle. There are some other examples. Our recent Vice President, Mr. Dick Cheney, who is in Queen Elizabeth's camp, not David Rockefeller's camp. He gave a speech in 2006 at the Organization of American States in New York. I believe it was February. It was sometime in 2006. Now, since when does a vice president, a sitting vice president of the United States, introduce anybody else unless that other person were the President of the United States. For example, there have been a couple of occasions recently where our current Vice President has introduced our current President. Well, that's not anything unusual. But how could it be that the Vice President of the United States would introduce any other speaker other than the President of the United States? Wouldn't it be always the other way around? Wouldn't it be any other speaker that you could think of, anywhere in this country or anywhere in the world, if he were speaking on United States soil, wouldn't it be the other speaker introducing the Vice President of the United States, not the Vice President of the United States introducing that other speaker? So lo and behold, who did Dick Cheney introduce at that meeting of the Organization of the American States? None other than David Rockefeller, who was sitting at the table and waiting to speak himself a few words. But instead of David Rockefeller or somebody else introducing the Vice President put himself in the role of an introducer, a subordinate role, and put Mr. Rockefeller, by that action, into a superior position as the one being introduced by him, by himself, the Vice President. But there's more. When David Rockefeller stood up, he and his pal, some foreigner who's the head of that organization, some Latino fellow, I can't remember his name, the head of the Organization of the American States, he and Mr. Rockefeller performed a very carefully choreographed, almost a dance, a kind of dance almost, or a skit, or a technique by which the two of them came over simultaneously to where Cheney was finishing his introductory speech, and they walked right up to him and they virtually pushed him out of the pulpit. They didn't actually touch him, but they raised their hands, and Mr. Rockefeller began to wave his hand and the fingers of his hand in a fashion like this to say, would you get out of the way? Can I speak now? I want to speak at the lectern. Could you let me speak? And he flicked his finger like this 2 or 3 times. And he was right in Mr. Cheney's face. He was like 3 inches from Mr. Cheney's face, and before Mr. Cheney knew what was going on, Mr. Rockefeller was already behind the pulpit. He didn't stand back and ask permission to get in front of the pulpit, but he got behind the pulpit while Cheney had still not left the pulpit. And he was flicking his finger at Mr. Cheney as if to say 2 different things at the same time. The ostensible meaning of his doing that was to say, may I please speak now? May I get a few words in? But the other meaning, the real meaning, was what he was conveying to the audience visually by flicking his hand and finger like that. He was saying to Dick Cheney, the current Vice President at that time, step out of the way. Step out of the way. I command you, step out of the way. Instantly, right now, even before Cheney had a chance to step away. And the other fellow, the foreigner, the Latino, who was the head of the Office of American States, and by the way, this tape is on the internet. Anybody can find it on the internet. Just look under David Rockefeller's name. That Latino fellow was right next to Rockefeller, so it was 2 against 1. 2, and that was necessary. It was necessary for that Latino fellow to participate because it would have looked a little bit too incorrect or improper if it had been only Rockefeller himself standing there flicking his finger and his hand and in effect telling Cheney to step away from the pulpit. If it had been only Rockefeller himself, it wouldn't have had the same, they wouldn't have had the same thin veil of cover or camouflage. They needed that extra camouflage, so they They choreographed it so that the Latino fellow was right next to Rockefeller, and it was two of them supplanting Cheney at the pulpit before Cheney could catch his breath, before Cheney could step away. And before Cheney knew it, while Cheney was had only 1 foot away from the pulpit and the other foot still at the pulpit, Rockefeller was already behind the pulpit and starting to speak. Now think for a minute. If Rockefeller were not the monarch that I have described him as being a few minutes ago, there's no possible way in the world that he could have done that, or would have done that, or would have gotten away with doing that, or would have been allowed by the vice president to do that. Now, there's still more. Mr. Cheney had put before some notes, or some ostensible notes, or pieces of paper at the rostrum, and he used those pieces of paper that he had left at the rostrum as a pretext for bowing his head and his shoulders for nearly, at least 60 seconds, an entire minute, between the time he got pushed away from the pulpit in the fashion I've just described and the time he finally was standing to the side of the pulpit. He kept his head and shoulders bowed like this, looking straight down. And he pretended to be taking the notes from the rostrum and putting them on the lower side table where he had been right next to the rostrum. But it took him an awfully long time to do that. Anybody else could have done that in 1/2 a second. It took him 60 seconds. It took him 60 seconds to take the papers, like these papers, from the rostrum, which was about chest level, and put them down on the side table, which was about waist level. And all that 60 seconds worth of time, he was hunched over in a deep bow, head and shoulders bound down like this. And Rockefeller's not even his monarch. His monarch is Queen Elizabeth. Rockefeller is the monarch of the other side, the opposing side. But just because he's a monarch, one of the two monarchs that control the world, just because he's a monarch and Cheney himself is only a common man in his own eyes, in Cheney's own eyes, even though he was vice president of the United States, he felt like bowing in that fashion, and that was his own idea. And here's one more thing. He never did sit down as long as Rockefeller was still up there on that stage. He continued standing while everybody else was sitting, and while Rockefeller was speaking, he continued standing. He didn't dare sit down because, of course, a commoner does not sit down in the presence of a monarch. The same thing is done in England. When Queen Elizabeth has a meeting with her ministers, they don't sit down. They stand up. As long as she's in the room, they continue standing. They won't sit. Because the idea is that for a commoner to sit in the presence of a monarch is less worship than that monarch requires. So Mr. Cheney observed the same rule, even though Rockefeller's not his monarch, but the opposing monarch. But simply because he's a monarch, Mr. Cheney, the Vice President of the United States, was hunched over in a never-ending bow and refused to sit but continued standing, even when he had no valid reason for standing. You can look at that entire tape. It takes about 3 minutes, maybe 4 minutes from beginning to end. Furthermore, the smart investigator stops looking for evidence the minute he has enough evidence to make his case. He stops, and then he goes forward and prosecutes. He doesn't keep looking for redundant evidence after redundant evidence after redundant evidence. They remind me of bus drivers I used to know that I've had experience of all my life. You know that when you're riding a city bus and you pull the cord, the bus driver is supposed to know that somebody wants to stop at the next stop. But how many times have I observed bus drivers with nothing but Crisco between their ears who crane their necks looking into the rearview mirror, and if they don't see anybody stand up even while the bus is still moving, and what kind of unintelligent person is going to try to stand up while the bus is still moving? He can't keep his balance. So even though someone wants to get off, he's not going to actually stand up from his seat until the bus stops. But the bus driver, and I've seen this many times, many different bus drivers have done this, they can't trust their own ears and their own brains, but they've got to double check their own ears and their own brains with a second redundant evidence of the same thing. So they crane their heads in the rearview mirror, and if they're riding the brake, they're not stepping on the brake like they should be, and they're almost missing the stop because they're waiting to see a confirmation, an unnecessary confirmation of what their ear and their brain should already have told them with a certainty, that somebody wants to stop at the next stop. So instead, the bus driver is riding the brake, he's pumping the brake, not sure whether to press the brake and actually stop, and he's grimacing into the rearview mirror and saying, how come somebody doesn't stand up? How come somebody doesn't stand up if they want to get off? And I learned from experience that if I don't want to miss my stop, and occasionally, once or twice I actually missed a stop because I don't want to use the word stupid. It's not a decorous word. But what other word can I use? The stupid bus driver actually missed the stop even though I had pulled the bell, and he kept on going just because he didn't see me stand up before he had stopped, as he was idiotically expecting me to do. So I learned from experience that if I wanted to stop there, I not only have to pull the bell, but I've got to brace myself against the seat in front of me and try to stand up while the bus is still moving, or he won't stop there. If he doesn't see me standing up in the rearview mirror, even while he's still moving. And that's exactly the way our FBI operates. Moreover, I'll interject here that it may seem superficially contradictory that in my preceding 6 tapes, at various points in those tapes, I've mentioned that the FBI has committed capital crimes themselves. For example, they killed those 3 Secret Service agents in Yosemite in 1983. The FBI did that. And the FBI blew up Oklahoma City. And the FBI connived at September 11th. I've mentioned those things. And then at other times in those previous 6 tapes, I've said things like, why doesn't the FBI understand how to look at evidence or how to read evidence? The viewer might be wondering how I can say in the same presentation or in the same series of presentations that they have committed capital crimes, and at the same time that I'm wondering why they don't enforce the law correctly or don't know how to read evidence correctly. Well, there's no contradiction there, because when I say that the FBI committed crimes, I mean those persons within the FBI who committed those crimes. But when I say, why doesn't the FBI know how to read evidence, I'm not referring to those deliberate malicious criminals in the FBI. I'm referring to those other individuals in the FBI who have not so far committed themselves deliberately and knowingly to a criminal life, but who are more or less wet behind the ears and just don't know how to read evidence. So there are 2 slightly different or quite different aspects of the FBI that I'm talking about when I say on the one hand they actually committed these crimes, and they did. When I say they, I don't mean every single member of the FBI. I mean those members of the FBI who actually did commit those crimes or participate in those crimes or connive at those crimes or cover up those crimes. And when I say, on the other hand, why doesn't the FBI know how to read evidence? I'm talking about those members of the FBI who have not deliberately and knowingly committed themselves to criminal acts, as some of them have. So you could say, in a sense, there are two FBIs. There's not supposed to be two FBIs, there's supposed to be one. But in a sense, there are two. And so when I identify them as the actual perpetrators of capital crimes on the one hand, that does not really contradict my saying, on the other hand, a few minutes later or a few minutes earlier, why can't the FBI ferret out the criminals? Why can't the FBI read the evidence correctly? Why are they so incompetent at reading the evidence? There's no contradiction there, because I'm talking about two different selections of persons within the FBI on each of those occasions. Now, I've got to go back to something I said in tape number 3, because I left out an important detail that is a key detail and needs to be mentioned. I said that when George Bush Sr. and Kissinger and probably Rockefeller burned down Queen Elizabeth's castle because of how Queen Elizabeth had baited George Bush Sr. in one of those 1992 presidential debates. There were 3 debates. It was one of them. I think it was the second one. But it was one of the 3, with the Negro woman from Florida asking him how he loves his grandchildren. He then burned down her castle. Bush Sr., Kissinger, and Rockefeller, most likely Rockefeller, almost certainly Rockefeller, because the other 2 would not have done it without Rockefeller's permission, because she's the monarch of the other side. They wouldn't have acted against the opposing monarch without permission from their monarch. Anyway, I said that she then held a meeting in which she used the expression annus horribilis, the Latin expression meaning a horrible year, referring to 1992. That was the year her castle was set on fire. Shortly after those presidential debates in October or so of 92, I think the castle was set on fire in December of 92. I said that she used the expression annus horribilis, and that she then referred to Hiroshima and then set the atomic bomb under Osaka or Kobe, Japan, and killed 6,000 people. And by the way, that was probably a plutonium bomb, not a hydrogen bomb. But it doesn't matter. It was certainly a nuclear weapon. Only a nuclear weapon would have enough power to cause an earthquake that would kill 6,000 people. So it was a nuclear weapon. And I said that she referred to Hiroshima. I neglected to mention exactly how she made the reference to Hiroshima. So I'll do that now, because it's an important key element in the evidence. I said that the words annus horribilis in Latin, if you take the same vowel, the same syllables, and construe them as Arabic, and the Arabic language is used occasionally by the English party because part of Queen Elizabeth's heritage is Middle Eastern, either Arabic or something close to Arabic, which I'll explain further in a minute. And Lady Susan Hussey also. Now, that's one of her top assistants. That's actually her top assistant, Lady Susan. But in Arabic, the syllables annus, or the first 2 syllables, anna, means I, the pronoun I, the first person pronoun. I'm sorry, annus horribilis. I in Arabic, that's the first 2 syllables, anna. And then the last letter of the word annus, the Latin word annus, is an S. And if you couple that last letter with the first 2 syllables of horribilis, you get the word sorry, the English word sorry. So you have anna, which means I in Arabic, and sorry in English. I'm sorry. And I said in session number 3, and I think I repeated in session number 4. I said she was saying, I'm sorry that I baited President Bush, the elder, during those debates by planting that question with the Negro woman from Florida about how do you love your grandchildren. But I said that she was only sarcastic. She didn't really mean I'm sorry, but she was using that expression sarcastically. Now, the reference to Hiroshima was constituted by the fact that by her saying I'm sorry, even though it was actually sarcastic, nevertheless, leaving aside for the moment the fact that it was sarcastic, when she said I'm sorry, it was the equivalent of saying that she's ashamed of herself, or she has something to be ashamed of, or she has been shamen or shamed by her own previous behavior. And that's the equivalent of saying Hera, capital H-E-R-A, the queen of the gods in the Greek system, in the Greek cosmology. And often Queen Elizabeth is equated with Hera, or Juno in the Roman nomenclature, just as often Rockefeller is equated with Jupiter or Zeus. I said that Bush, the younger, referred to him as God once on a different occasion. So Queen Elizabeth often refers to herself and is referred to by others as Hera, the queen of the Greek gods. Hera, shaman, the past participle of the verb shame. In other words, Hera ashamed of herself, or Hera shamed. Shamed, S-H-A-M-E-D, is the past tense. Shaman, S-H-A-M-E-N, is the past participle. Hera shaman. In other words, Queen Elizabeth, as Hera, the queen of the Greek goddess, the queen of the Greek gods and goddesses, has been shamen both by her past action in baiting President Bush at the 1992 debates, by that planted question by the Negro woman from Florida who represented Queen Elizabeth, as I explained before. She's shamed by that action, and also by her, as evidenced by her now saying she's sorry. She's sorry. When you say you're sorry, when you say I'm sorry, you're saying I'm ashamed of myself. I'm ashamed of what I have done. Now, of course, this is all staged in order to be able to say Hera is shaman, or Hera shaman, and that has a homophonic relationship to the name Hiroshima. Hera shaman, by her behavior, and as evidenced now by her apology, even though it was a sham apology, a sarcastic apology. On the surface, the fact that she's shamed by her behavior is evidenced by the fact that she said, I'm sorry. Annus sorabilis means, if you take the Arabic for the word I and the English word sorry, when she said annus horribilis, she was saying, I'm sorry. She was saying it sarcastically, but the fact that she was saying, I'm sorry, enables her now to say, Hera is shaman. And it enables other people to say about her, Hera is shaman. And just leave out the verb in the middle, the verb is. And you have Hera shaman, like you say, movie actress celebrated, or sports star honored. You don't have to have the verb in the middle. If you put the verb in the middle, you would say sports star is honored by a special award tonight, or movie actor is celebrated by a special dinner tonight. But you can leave out the verb in the middle and just say, for example, if you've got a headline on a newspaper, it might just say, instead of saying such and such sports figure is honored tonight at a gala celebration, they might leave out the verb to save space and just say sports figure honored instead of saying sports figure is honored. Or movie actor celebrated instead of movie actor is celebrated. So you have Hera Shaman instead of Hera is Shaman or Hera has been Shaman. All you have to say is Hera Shaman. You have like a participial expression without an active or a copulative verb. And from that referenced expression, Hera Shaman, she was referring to the name Hiroshima. And then sometime afterwards, that nuclear device was exploded in Japan. Now, Queen Elizabeth, I've always tried to think highly of because I remember her as a young girl. I remember what she was like when she was young. And I remember how she used to say, when she first became queen, that she would try, to the best of her ability, to follow the example of Christ. And I believe she meant that. Now, I have been entreating her for years and years and years to do right by me, because all of her people have been doing wrong by me for the last many, many years, the last several decades, the last couple of decades and more. Her side of the world, her party, the English party, even more than the Jewish party, has been abusing me in the most egregious and felonious manner. It can hardly be described what they've done. It would take a separate hour to describe it. And I'd have to bring audio tapes to give examples of how they've abused me. They've set people, they've incited people to pick fights with me. I mentioned this in an earlier tape. But before I would give a complete description of how they've abused me, I would want to have audio tapes to show the evidence. And the present recording system is not set up to handle audio tapes. It's set up only to handle my speaking voice. So perhaps on another occasion or in another studio, I'll be able to go into that more deeply. But I've entreated Queen Elizabeth over the past many years to put a stop to her people. MI5, she controls MI5. The other party, Rockefeller's party, controls MI6, even though MI6 is in London. MI5 is the domestic service in London, and that's controlled by Queen Elizabeth. MI5 and the American CIA, which is like MI5's executors here in America, the principal part of the American CIA anyway, the 51% that I spoke of in an earlier presentation. The 51% of the American CIA acts as the executor for MI5, which in turn is the executor for Queen Elizabeth. That is the source of most of the abuse that I've been getting. Mr. Gates, our current Secretary of Defense, who considers Queen Elizabeth to be his monarch, even though the current president considers Rockefeller to be his monarch. And that's not unusual for different parties to be in the administration at the same time. But Mr. Gates implied recently to me that they're going to tone it down a little bit, or even substantially, tone down the abuse. But I don't want it toned down, I want it stopped. And until it's stopped, I'm going to have to make opposition to the entire regime. And that includes Queen Elizabeth herself, in the most efficient way that I can possibly make that opposition. Now, Queen Elizabeth not only has been behind the murders of children on many different occasions. I mentioned the 300 children in Chechnya. That was her direct order to kill those 300 children in Chechnya in order to retaliate against what the Jewish party, Rockefeller's party, did to the World Trade Center, which was Elizabeth's headquarters in America, or one of her administrative headquarters. But not only those 300 children in Chechnya, but many other times Queen Elizabeth has killed innocent children. Now, Rockefeller's done the same thing. Rockefeller and Kissinger and their agents have done the same thing. So it's not just Elizabeth, it's both of them. But just at the moment, I've got 8 minutes left in this hour, in this 54-minute or 52-minute segment. I'll mention a couple of the other children that Queen Elizabeth has killed. She killed a young 10-year-old girl by the name of Zoe Evans in England back in September 1996. She did that in order to signify that she and her party wanted me dead. That's why they picked her, because of her name, Zoe Evans. It's an anagram of my name. Earlier that same year, in the spring of 1996, Queen Elizabeth and her second or third ranking minister at the time, John Major, who was prime minister, and her entire party, MI5, murdered 16 children, ages 5 and 6, up in Dunblane, Scotland. They did that for several reasons. They did it because the opposing party, the Rockefeller's party, had threatened her step-grandson, Prince Harry. He's not really her grandson. None of her blood is in Prince Harry. His father was not Prince Charles, but she likes him, so he was threatened by Rockefeller's party because they were threatening me. Queen Elizabeth's party was threatening me. And both of the intelligence agencies on both sides, on the English side and on the Jewish side, have been playing a game for many years referring to me as an 11-year-old boy. Well, the truth is they're the 11-year-old boys and I'm the grown-up. But they like to play a game and refer to me as the 11-year-old boy. Well, it just so happened that at that time, in other words, they're referring to me as mentally slow. Even though I'm mentally about 1,000,000 times quicker than any of them, they like to play the game of referring to me as mentally slow because I'm not quite as wicked as they are, maybe. Anyway, they have referred to me often as being an 11-year-old boy, even though I'm a grown-up man. Now, at that time, and I was in England at that time, Prince Harry was 11. So when MI5, Queen Elizabeth's agents, were threatening my life, as they were, Rockefeller's party, who wanted me alive, even though they've disrespected me and abused me themselves. So it's not like they really like me, but for their own reasons, for some ulterior reasons, they wanted to keep me alive. They didn't want me to be killed just then. They said to Elizabeth, if you hurt Harry Zane, we'll harm your step-grandson, Prince Harry, correlating his name, Harry, with my name, and his actual age, 11, with my supposed mental age of 11. Well, in response to that, Queen Elizabeth killed several 5- and 6-year-old children. 5 plus 6 equals 11. They were 5- and 6-year-olds, which is a reference to Prince Harry being an 11-year-old. They killed children in Dunblane, Scotland, because they were referring to Donald Trump Dunblane refers to the Donald. Donald Trump is David Rockefeller's stepson in a manner of speaking and is his heir to the political throne. Donald Trump will be the next emperor or king when David Rockefeller dies. So, and Rockefeller is very fond of Donald Trump, personally fond of him. So they were threatening Rockefeller's stepson because Rockefeller had threatened Queen Elizabeth's step-grandson. But in order to make that point poetically, so to speak, they killed 16 5- and 6-year-old children. One of them was a girl by the name of Mary Beaton. B as in baby, E, A, T as in Tom, O, N as in Nancy. In retaliation for that, the other side, Rockefeller's side, killed that little 6-year-old girl, JonBenet Ramsey, here in America later the same year because her name is an anagram of the name Mary Beaton. So just to prove a political point, Rockefeller and Kissinger and Carlucci, who takes orders from Rockefeller and Kissinger, killed a little girl in Colorado, JonBenet Ramsey. By the way, I have 2 minutes left. Is that correct? 2 minutes. All right. By the way, the fellow who confessed to that crime is the one who did it. The so-called DNA evidence is deliberately overlooked on occasion when the intelligence agencies claim between and amongst themselves that they have a proper reason for doing so. This was one of those occasions. Supposedly the DNA evidence cleared him, that fellow whose name is John Mark Carr. He actually killed her, just like he confessed he did. Another similar occasion on which DNA evidence ostensibly was simply lied about by the intelligence agencies was the case of the fourth wife of that fellow Peterson in Chicago recently. Her body was found in a blue container, but they claim it wasn't her, that the DNA evidence proved it was another woman. It wasn't another woman. It was that woman. Stacy was her name. He himself confessed on national television at least twice or three times, using very thinly veiled language, that he had done it. And I'll tell you in another tape, because I'm almost out of time, why he killed her. He killed her because he was told to kill her by the Jewish party in order to make a point about something completely unrelated to him and his wife. I have to leave it there for now because I'm out of time. So I'll pick up some of these strands in my next presentation. Thank you for attending to these matters, and I hope that you'll continue to follow my past recording sessions. This is the 7th, and there will be an 8th one. There will be another one made today. So as of the end of the day today, there will be 8 such sessions as this one. Not quite 8 hours altogether. Each session is approximately 54 minutes. Thank you very much, and please continue to attend to my presentations. Thank you.
Out of time, this is the John Savers Variety Spotlight Show. My name is John Savers. I'm your host. I appreciate your tuning in. Hope to see you again next time.